the skin is really an extension of the mucosa, or vice versa, right? There's this natural transition in the body at which skin becomes mucosa, and mucosa forms the primary layer of the gut. So there's this really tied connection between the skin and the gut.
Welcome to the Learn Skin podcast with me, Dr. Raja.
And me, Dr. Hadar, where we discuss all things skin.
Join us as we delve into the art and science of skin health in today's episode.
Hey, Raja, can you say the thing I told you to tell them?
Of course. We are board-certified dermatologists. This podcast is meant for educational and informational purposes only and is not considered medical advice, nor does it serve as a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. All opinions shared do not express the views of Learn Health, Inc. Let's get to the good stuff.
Well, hello everyone. It's going to be just me, so I can say, hey Hadar, and then Hadar's going to say, hey, I'm going to let you do this one on your own. So it's going to be me for the Learn Skin podcast today, but of course it's never just me. So I'll say, hey, all of you listening out there, have you ever thought about how the gut connects to the skin? And your response would be, of course, right? Holistically, it's all connected. Well, we're going to deep dive into some of the immunology and some of the science behind it, but I'm not doing it by myself. I'm here with Dr. Jason Hawks. He's a board-certified dermatologist. I've known him for many years. He's done some stellar podcasts with us before. So Jason, welcome to the podcast. And I know we're going to be talking more about the science and immunology of that gut-skin connection.
Thanks, Raja. Happy to be doing this again. I always love these podcasts. We get to get into some science and bring it back to the clinician. So this is a complicated but really exciting topic to get into, that gut-skin immune axis connection.
Yeah, so maybe to kick things off, why don't you just tell us a little bit about, your background in dermatology, what got you into thinking about immunology, because you have a rich research background, and then let's jump right into the science of what we want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, my background really started first in science, even before medicine. So, I was originally thinking I was going to go into chemistry or biochemistry, maybe a PhD, kind of hit some physiology, anatomy, got interested in maybe more of the human side of the science. And, medical school just really kind of filled that gap of that investigation, but, your model being humans. And, I've spent time, at the NIH. I've been, I was back at Rockefeller University where I did my master's in clinical investigation. And I think for me, medicine is richer when you can bring in the basic science and the research components and use that to say, how can I help the patient sitting in front of me? So that intersection for me, between immunology and dermatology, that was sort of a late finding for me in medical school. But I think dermatology with the skin is such a rich immune organ, twice as many immune cells in the skin than in the blood. This is this great intersection that for me has really set up the foundation for medical dermatology. And I think naturally the diseases that I found an interest in, psoriasis, atopic dermatitis, HS, these are all conditions that we'll talk about today as having a very strong connect with the immune response, but also the gut and the microbiome.
I think what we've started to uncover is that these skin diseases, we used to just primarily take a topical approach. Maybe we'd do some systemics with the hopes that it would get to the skin and do something at the skin portion. But I think now, especially as we've uncovered the importance of taking an integrative approach and understanding the body is all tied together, these diseases are not just skin diseases, are they, Jason? They're much deeper than that. In fact, before I have Jason talk about that, he is going to be lecturing on this very topic at the upcoming Integrative Dermatology Symposium. It's in Reno, October 27th through the 29th. So for all of you that want to learn more about the science of this connection, obviously there's been traditions that have talked about it for eons and eons, but now we're really getting those biochemical pathways. Join us. There's a hybrid option as well, Integrative Dermatology Symposium. So Jason, talk a little bit about the science and this connection. And the skin really is much beyond the skin, isn't it?
Yeah, you mentioned it. We viewed so many of these conditions, as a primary skin disorder. So, as you mentioned, for eons, right, there's biblical references, people in stories as having what they thought was probably leprosy. Many of those cases may have actually been psoriasis. So, skin disease has been an outward manifestation that was visible at all stages of, when human life was around. But what we didn't appreciate, and I think as we've building on over time, is that it's more than skin deep, right? We always make that little joke, but I think we made the connection of a skin disease not just being the skin, but then being linked to systemic inflammation, which led us down this whole path of the identification or recognition of comorbidities, right? With systemic inflammation, psoriasis has really kind of led that journey. But now we're sort of starting to look at what the basis or the source or the origin of this dysregulation, this dysbiosis, the inflammation that comes, and where does it all get started. And that's really brought us back to starting to look at individual organs or tissue types to try to see where this breakdown of immune tolerance occurs, which leads to disease. And the gut, as the biggest reservoir of the microbiome in the body, has obviously, been under the microscope for that reason.
Look at that, pun intended. I love it. Already starting with the dad jokes, and Jason, you jumped right in. So, which disease should we start with? I mean, you have a lot of conditions that have manifestations in the gut as like modified diseases like psoriasis, but maybe take us through what's happening down in the gut that's triggering the immune system or either assuaging the immune system. What is it that's going on down there?
Yeah, I think maybe even coming back a little more high level is that the gut, the skin, and the immune system, they are inextricably linked. You cannot separate one from the other. And that's one of the observations that the research community has. So when we're talking about those three components, the microbiome really represents the whole repertoire of, pathogens. We're talking bacteria, yeast, viruses in the human body. And the gut, as I mentioned, is really the largest reservoir of that microbiome, and it plays a central role in maintaining that homeostasis of the immune system. And the gut, as we can talk about in some of these diseases, has very specific ways in which it contributes to the immune response and protection and balance and skin barrier. And then, of course, the skin, as I mentioned, being a very, highly immune organ, more so even than I mentioned in the blood, that it's going to interact with these other tissues. And I think it's, leading into these other diseases, I think it's really important and relevant to note that the skin is really an extension of the mucosa or vice versa, right? There's this natural transition in the body at which skin becomes mucosa, and mucosa forms the primary layer of the gut. So there's this really tied connection between the skin and the gut. And of course, the microbiome, as an interface across both. So it leads to a number of, I think, critical diseases in dermatology that we frequently encounter. So atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, HS, acne, rosacea, and even some of these exanthems that we see, like a viral exanthem or exanthems that occur after infection. So pityriasis rosea, guttate psoriasis, one of my favorite conditions, is one that's had this very, very clear link to the microbiome and a pathogen, I think has given us a nice template. So this kind of sets the stage for some of the conditions that might come up when we're talking about the gut-skin immune axis.
Can you talk a little bit more about xanthams, because viral xanthams, because this is something that obviously we see clinically. Someone gets sick, they get some sort of viral infection, then they break out with the rash. So can you speak to the gut-skin connection, or at least the shift in the microbiome? What's going on there?
Yeah, so I think there's some key aspects that the gut, sort of the role that the gut plays in the immune response. One is that the gut, as I mentioned, as a reservoir, serves as a very strong sort of anti-pathogen, right? So there are many good bacteria we hear about that protect us from other infections. So C. diff and yeast infections as being the opposite side of that coin when we lose good bacteria. But the gut is also really critical in being a place in which, antigen presenting cells, dendritic cells, prime other cells like our T cells. And that's why we have lymphoid tissues in the gut. And the gut also produces metabolites, for example, small chain fatty acids, which have a very strong link to the immune system. It's a physical barrier. So it's, again, protection against things getting in. Bacteria and other cells can translocate in and out of the gut. It gets access to the bloodstream. But probably the most important for the gut-skin connection is the fact that cells have the innate receptors. So we talk about the adaptive immune response versus the innate immune response. The innate immune response is this very rapid, non-specific, quick action as a protection, as opposed to our, the typical T cell response we talk about disease. But the cells in the gut and the skin that have these innate receptors, we call them the pattern recognition receptors. So like a toll-like receptor, for example, would be a very common one of these innate receptors. But these innate receptors are really primed to respond to pathogens. So, when we have an infection, the different TLR receptors are going to either recognize the cell wall or flagella, for example, on these pathogens. So it's primed already to respond to these infections or insults or trauma. And what we see in this crossover from a normal response to a disease response is that the response to that pathogen or environmental factor is dysregulated. So a good example are these exanthems, for example, or the guttate psoriasis link that most people who get streptococcal pharyngitis don't ever develop guttate psoriasis. But for whatever reason, in those patients who are susceptible for guttate psoriasis, say like those who carry the HLA, what used to be CW6 or the 0602 now, that HLA gene variant, for whatever reason, is so strongly linked to this immune response that this exaggerated immune response leads to sort of collateral damage, as I like to say. And so this upregulated response to try to respond to this pathogen or shut down this pathogen's infectivity triggers a cascade of other immune events that don't stay regulated and end up leading to an overactive or an overexpression of the immune response. And so I think it's this balance of our response to these pathogens and how well the body can sort of keep it in check. And I think for the most part, whether this is through genetics or other mechanisms, the people with disease who end up getting these chronic inflammatory diseases have sort of this exaggerated response to a normal exposure.
Jason, I think that I love the way that you just went through this explanation because it speaks to the fact that there is a variability too in our responses and that there's a variability in the microbiome. There's a variability in some of our diseases. And, perhaps this is going to be some source of that. Well, why don't we jump into some more specifics around the immune system and maybe the power of some of the treatments that are also emerging. So what do you think about this take where we're looking at like a singular cytokine and saying, hey, this might be the thing that we block and it's going to, cure all of the disease? I think we've seen, like, for example, IL-17, IL-23, they do a immensely amazing job on cutaneous psoriasis, but maybe they don't hit the joints as effectively, like the IL-23s, for example. Although, they still have some activity, but there's some variability. What are your thoughts there around singular cytokines, or what about the JAK inhibitors where you have a little bit more of a broad sort of approach?
Yeah, I mean, you can take just about any complex inflammatory condition that we treat, and there's not a single example of where one mechanism of action with very high specificity worked for every patient. Now, granted, in psoriasis, as you mentioned, we're hitting, PASI 100, but we're hitting those in 60, 70% of patients, maybe with some new therapies coming out, maybe 80%. But that means 1 in 5, aren't having high levels of response. And in fact, we occasionally, and not as common as you might think, but more rare, we see patients who just don't respond at all, who clearly have psoriasis. And so I think just like any other condition outside of dermatology, there's a spectrum. We are trying to balance sort of complete suppression of the pathogenic response, the thing driving disease, but trying to mitigate, again, that collateral damage. And so, we could give every patient, prednisone and cyclosporin and, broad-acting immunosuppressants, and that will treat most of these conditions. But the downside are the adverse effects or the collateral damage. It's suppressing other biological pathways or mechanisms that don't necessarily contribute to the disease. So we don't want to blow up the whole immune system. And so, but I think to your point, we have therapies that are so specific. I like the analogies of, bombs or shotguns or snipers, because it gives you how specific you are. And so I think, a lot of the biologics we have are really, finely tuned snipers. They can hit an aspect of the immune system and not really impact others. But as you mentioned, when you have a more complex disease, say like patients with psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis, you run the risk of inhibiting a pathway that's primarily driving the skin disease, but not really driving the inflammatory arthritis. And so in a situation there, then we're either talking about combination therapies, like using two snipers, hitting different pathways, or using these kind of shotguns, a little bit broader acting immune responses like the JAK inhibitors. So I think for more complex diseases where there's not just one predominant signal or one predominant signaling pathway, we may need either broader acting or sort of the combination. And I think we'll probably realistically have both eventually, where we're going to get both targeted therapies that hit two, like dual inhibition, or some of those that just we can back up a little bit, hit multiple pathways, and yet not have a big downstream effect on the whole immune system.
Jason, I love what you just said. You're talking about the fact that you can have very pinpoint accuracy, but sometimes maybe we do need to broaden a little bit. Maybe this goes back to the conversation around the gut and the skin axis, because the way the gut's interrelating to the immune system, which then, has obviously these distant impact on the skin, probably isn't just going to be one cytokine. I mean, I know that Th17 maturation occurs down in the gut, and I'm sure there are other inflammatory, components that are also going through a maturation process down there. Perhaps with psoriasis, there's a little bit of this notion that we found that cytokine pathway. But what about diseases like hidradenitis suppurativa, or say like vitiligo, or alopecia areata, where we know there probably is a gut skin connection. As there's these case reports now where people get a fecal microbiota transplant and their alopecia areata got better all of a sudden. What do you think is going on there? And what is the power of perhaps, say, like a JAK inhibitor that you wouldn't get with the biologic in those scenarios?
Yeah, so when we talk about, I think psoriasis and HS are two really good examples, because what we find with both diseases is that there's a very high prevalence and a strong link to comorbidity of inflammatory bowel disease. And what makes this even a little more complicated is that traditionally we think about patients getting a disease like psoriasis or HS, and then at some later point developing inflammatory bowel disease or another comorbidity. But we know that that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that we have many patients who develop inflammatory bowel disease first and then develop HS or psoriasis. We see that with psoriatic arthritis. Like in my training, I was always taught you get skin psoriasis, plaque psoriasis, and then 5 to 7 years later, a third of patients get psoriatic arthritis. In fact, we still hear that over the pulpit all the time. It's just fundamentally not true. We have many patients who present with psoriatic arthritis who never develop plaque psoriasis. And we have patients who develop the comorbidity, obesity, for example, in pediatric psoriasis. Most of the patients with pediatric psoriasis, more than 95%, develop obesity first before they develop pediatric psoriasis. So what it raises is this sort of depends on which side you're coming at, these two options. Either one, the disease leads to a gut change that ends up playing a role in the disease, or two, you have this gut change which sets off the chain reaction, which eventually leads to this breakdown in tolerance and activation of the immune system to then sustain chronic disease. And so we have to be really clear on which group we're talking about, because I do think there's a scenario in which dysbiosis can drive a chronic inflammatory disease. And I think you've just mentioned one example where fecal transplant, for example, can change the microbiome, can get it back closer to a healthy, normal microbiome as opposed to this dysbiotic state. And in doing so, it can control systemic inflammation, because we know the gut can be a source of systemic inflammation. And there's other scenarios in which I think you have basically disease that unregulated creates this highly toxic inflammatory environment, which breaks down the barrier, and we start to see changes in the gut. And so in those situations, maintaining the inflammation and getting that regulated can probably lead to some adjustments in the gut. And I think it's this chicken and the egg, which comes first. That's what we haven't really teased out. But there are, I think, probably the best explanation we have right now in terms of how these diseases are going to respond to, say, targeted therapies in the gut is that I think the gut probably serves as a modulator or maybe like a dimmer switch on the inflammation, that if you really have dysbiosis, you can make the inflammation higher or stronger. And addressing the gut, sort of getting you back to this normal, healthy repertoire of pathogens in the gut, can help reduce your burden of inflammation and might therefore change the disease course. I think for the most part, changing the microbiome and helping get it back to this healthier state, we see it clearly helps disease, but in very few cases, do diseases disappear like the case example you have. Now, those cases are very interesting, and we want to learn what was it that changed. But for the most part, for example, we don't want patients to believe that if you just change your gut, that most patients with psoriasis are going to go clear. And there's good explanation for that. Probably one main thing with these T-cell driven diseases like HS is that we have these long-lived resident memory T cells that once they end up in those tissues, it's very difficult to shut them off. And so even changing a diet or your environment, like HS patients no longer smoking, we're probably not going to shut off the disease entirely, but it can work complementary with these traditional therapies that we do talk about, including the biologics and the JAK inhibitors. Now, the catch with the JAK inhibitors, which we haven't talked about, is that also increases your risk for infections, right? And so that dysbiosis can actually worsen as a result of this broad impact on the immune system. So again, that's another level of balance that maybe you don't have to deal with as much with targeted therapies like the biologics.
We can do another session on JAK inhibitors. I feel like they're largely misunderstood or perhaps maybe need more clinical context, but we'll come back to that. But Jason, every time we have these conversations, I love the biochemical pathways that we discuss. But not only that, we almost got to the answer of the chicken or the egg. We didn't get there, but we almost did, didn't we? Almost the biochemical closeness that you can to the chicken and the egg. As always, Jason, love having you on the podcast. Again, to all of you listening, Jason is going to be speaking at the Integrative Dermatology Symposium coming up in Reno, October 27th through the 29th. And who knew the gut-skin conversation would be packed full of immunology and the microbiome and biochemical pathways. Thanks for doing this with us, Jason.
Thanks, Raj. Always fun. There's going to be a great lecture. Hope to see you there, and we'll be diving into this.
Thank you so much for supporting us through the last several seasons. We love receiving your questions on social media. And now, you can call them in as well.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're a licensed medical practitioner, call us at 424-309-8757 and leave a detailed recording with your name, location, clinical question, and it may just be chosen to be answered live on the next podcast.
We look forward to your submissions. And as always, stay curious.